Thank you, Mr. Johnson. And up next is Mr. Aris Georges, who's trained in architecture since he was 12 with a tutor. He achieved his master's degree at the Lloyd Wright School of Architecture in Arizona, where Michael Johnson, our previous lecturer, was his teacher in the 1980s. Since 2015, he has been designing custom prefabricated homes with the Lindo company in Seattle, Washington, and works to promote good design that is widely produced and available. Aris taught graduate schools and workshops on design, research, and graphics, and has been a mentor to hundreds of students in the US and Greece. Aris is passionate about nature and architecture and the relationship between nature and the human experience. Please welcome Aris Georges.
Good morning. In the spirit of the theme of INTERARCH, did I say that right? INTERARCH? 2018, I would like to submit a slightly different position. I would call it more a romance. Imagine in the next 25 minutes or so that it's basically a pause from all of the either scientific or political or academic approach and see it more as a personal experience with this idea of sustainability. I think that in order to have a solution to the sustainability issue, we need to start with our love of nature. The title pays homage to Milton Glaser, the graphic designer who made the famous symbol I, heart in New York. And I give it to you because this is how I have to relate to nature in order to develop any kind of position for sustainability. And at the same time, to remind ourselves that we are on a spaceship. It's going really fast, faster than we can even perceive. And it has 4.5 billion years of memory of how it should be working as a system, and a system of systems. So taking you to this romance, I will start with this special word, geometry, which translates to the measure of the earth, or one could even stretch it to the architecture of the earth, which is a language of relationships and principles that can help us decode nature, maybe even help us become earth citizens or earth architects without boundaries and nations. Somehow, a revival of maybe the hippie. A major problem I see in our present state is that we are challenged in our application of systemic solutions, and we are risking turning our efforts into a mere greenwash. But let's remember that growing plants on walls that are themselves of the old paradigm is something nature has been doing for years, ages. So let's look at some of the difficulties. In order to make our material world today, our engineering is based on three forces. The first is that we heat things at very high temperatures. The second is that we beat them with high impact. And the third is that we treat them with very toxic chemicals. All of those together waste more than 90% of the energy they use in order to yield the materials we need. So how do we understand the force that nature uses to make the material world? Nature grows things, and when they have fulfilled a cycle, they decay, decompose, and nature recycles them. In the emerging and highly promising field of biomimicry, which is biology talking to the design world, we are told that maybe the future will be in 3D printing our material world. It's beginning to happen. But the problem is, right now we're using highly toxic materials to 3D print instead of nature. We have a long way to go, but I think we may be on the right track. What this means is that we are in for a paradigm shift, and those are never easy. In my experience, I think the paradigm shift starts with resensitizing ourselves to nature, and do it in a very personal and genuine way, not influenced by trends. So maybe my unpopular proposal is to look at nature as a creative resource. I know this is a word that for some sounds maybe not serious, but if nature is a source for our creative responses to the world, then I'd like to walk you through what that meant for me as a teacher and as a person. So how does geometry really play out in this? It's not a new idea that geometry has been a primary tool in responding to nature that humans discovered and have utilized since the origins of civilization. I will not tire you with the well-trodden methods by which geometry has been a tool of analysis and synthesis. You can find all this easily on the internet. Suffice it to say that every epoch has its own gift. I would like to walk you through some aspects of geometry as it implicates other lesser-known areas of both our experiences and our knowledge. First of all, the concept that it is in and of itself a theory. So geometry started with Euclid in ancient Greece and the theory of the elements, which became the fundamental basis for science to develop. There are some theoretical departures from the Euclidean geometry that started happening the last 100 years or so, but those don't replace Euclid, they actually add to Euclid. If Euclid's axioms did not really exist, most of us could not have flown here. We couldn't have built airplanes that fly. Now, in philosophy, where geometry was implicated in a way of thinking, this is a translation of an epigraph or a sign that was over the entry to Plato's Academy that said, "Without knowledge of geometry, no one should enter here," meaning it's going to be a lost cause if you try even to approach philosophy without understanding geometry. So in that context, one wonders, if geometric thinking is supposed to be the highest form of thinking, what really happens to the state of our public discourse, in which I think sustainability is a key part? When the arguments are poorly made, attention to elegance is lost, and the street smarts becomes the new normal. But let's not get there. Let's look up. Years and years ago, we started looking up at the sky, especially the night sky, and looking at the stars and picking out patterns. And these patterns help us understand even our own movement as a world. This, for example, is the map of the pattern that the planet Venus makes as it moves around both the Earth and the Sun, or as seen from our movement from the Earth. So in contrast, one wonders, how do our children today in big cities? Recently we heard that more than half of the Earth population is in cities and no longer out in nature. How do those children look up at the yellow, polluted sky at night and see stars and imagine patterns? Another aspect of geometry in mathematics. Mathematical models and algorithms can be expressed geometrically. This is a simple app that explores the simple rule of splitting one direction into two. It's called bifurcation. But when you visualize something, even as complicated as a mathematical formula, the brain responds differently. An image is hardwired in our brain to be more understood. It has aesthetics, it has pleasing effects on our brain. So one wonders if we belittle dreaming and visualizing as not important. If we belittle abstraction and beauty in our thought itself, do we have a chance at becoming better neighbors and better Earth cohabitants? Geometry and physics. This is areas that are emerging now. Particle physicists are exploring the way the nature works at a very microscopic level, a whole different scale that we perceive. But in order to understand how particles interact, they found that they all work with geometric symmetries, and they can plan out maps, and then where there is a place where something is missing, they can speculate a particle there, and then they go into the lab and they find it. More geometry in physics is even more recent. They found that this particular geometric pattern in field theory for particles has accelerated about 20 years of calculations, simply applying geometric thinking to their old calculations. And this was a quote that came out with the publication of that shape. It's called the amplituhedron. And in a way, left everybody surprised that geometry could be that fundamentally engaged, even in science. So it seems like it's everywhere. But that is just to give you a sense that when I say geometry, it's not just, a light phrase. For me, it's very serious. So in a way, I kind of backed myself up with all of that previous presentation to come to this particular point now, which goes back to the idea of responding to the world creatively. I'm very interested in how geometry is an art form, and how as an art form it allows us not so much to produce something, but to experience it in the process of making it. This, for example, was an exercise I was doing in one of my classes, and Michael Johnson, being a very good teacher of mine, he actually did the same exercise and submitted it for grade. It's an exploration of a simple drawing in three-dimensional space by simply cutting paper and lifting it and studying it in the sun to see the kind of shadows. The very same drawing producing a tremendous variety of product. So there is something as pure joy for me in how geometry can be improvisational, experimental, kind of like jazz. I don't know if any of you appreciate jazz. It's usually something that you have to grow into it. It's completely free, save for some simple rules. But with those simple rules, a tremendous amount of creativity can happen. So I'll walk you through an exercise that we were doing at the Frank Lloyd Wright School, which embeds this notion of learning to sensitize to nature. I call them etudes in the spirit of the musical form, like the Chopin etudes, where you sit at the piano or you take an instrument and you don't care what it's going to sound like. You're simply in with the instrument and you're exploring something, whether it is a musical idea, a technique, or just simply having a good time. Now, Frank Lloyd Wright, I think, was the utmost natural architect. We can call him many other things, but natural is the way I think he existed. He called his architecture organic, and I think he meant both of nature in terms of being not an insult to the landscape when the building is built, but also of the nature in the abstract sense, like the natural state of architecture. Now, he was influenced, of course, everybody's influenced. When he was a child, his mother got him the Froebel toys, the blocks. Froebel was the father of the kindergarten movement. And so he grew up looking at these beautiful geometric shapes as language, how he can put them together, making things. And at the same time, he discovered this fine Japanese art form, the ukiyo-e, which depicts scenes of nature and of culture and of life in Japan in a very flat way, almost inviting the perception to bring the depth. He did not think that the chiaroscuro technique was necessary for architecture. With that, he said that he discovered a gospel of simplification and learned how to eliminate anything that was insignificant. And here you can see a reconstruction of the Unity Temple with the blocks, and then one of his famous renderings that obviously pay homage to the Japanese print. How did he learn it further? Well, his teacher was Louis Sullivan, who gave him this book. This was a biological, actually a botanical illustration book from France in the 1800s, in which the plants were not shown just as a freehand sketch, but actually as drawings, elevations, sometimes sections, plans, obviously a very architectural depiction of the plan. And in a way, for him, that was a method of understanding how the plant assumed its form, both in terms of the specifics of how form was made, but also start hypothesizing how that form had a purpose. Because in nature, every form has a specific purpose. Now, biology emerges at the time when the neoclassical is at its highest. So, obviously, being of Greek origin myself, I don't exactly hate 100% what's on the right. Obviously, those buildings in ancient Greece, in a way, inspired a lot of architecture. Even in the city yesterday, I was looking at the Parthenon left and right. In the United States, the Parthenon is everywhere. But the thing is that biology asked a very important question, and that is, can we learn from nature how to build? Now, Louis Sullivan had an interesting theory about how to get geometry and nature to work together. He wrote a book in 1924 called System of Architectural Ornament, and in that he calls the simple geometric lines, like the simple shapes, the inorganic, and then he takes, it's almost like he makes those with the 4H pencil, which is hard, sharp lines, and then with a softer, maybe 2B or 4B pencil, comes and makes the freehand shapes over those geometric shapes. He calls that the efflorescence of the pattern. So, and he calls that the organic. So in other words, a real adherence to the original curvilinear form. Now the student, like every good student, surpasses the master by saying, wait a minute, why do we need to do the second part? Let's keep the geometry as the organic. And from that point on, Frank Lloyd Wright tells us that with geometry you can emulate the natural form. And he teaches that to his secretary. Then his name was Eugene Massillin, who was a fine painter that starts doing these abstractions. So you see here a fine pastel drawing of the ocotillo. It's a particular cactus in Arizona, blooming in the spring with these bursts of red as if they were flames. Michael and Suzanne's house is surrounded by them. And on the right is his depiction of it through geometry. Years later, I assumed the mantle of teaching this class at the school and bringing the computer into the mix, because I'm the generation the computer blew up on my face while I was in school. And I had to switch from learning and loving the hand drawing to having to use the computer. And with the computer, I discovered that it doesn't again replace the hand. It's not, everything has to replace something else when we progress. It enhances it, it adds something to it. So I'm very interested in how digital and analog play out together. So in this exercise, the same plant, ocotillo, executed very differently, but again, looking at it in terms of a source for inspiration in making form. And I'll show you how that plays out in a process, step by step. We'll start with a different plant. This is the sumac. It's a bush that turns into this incredible red in the fall. One of the things that I saw in it, that in the leaf pattern and in the branches themselves, there was some sense of parallel lines, those repeating parallel lines. So the first step is to make a freehand sketch with which to start exploring this idea. How do those parallel lines work out? And as moving the hand freely it begins to tell you which way it wants to go geometrically. And slowly from that, you can extrapolate something. Out of that something, you can start with a simple hypothesis. In this case, can I take the simplest forms yield the most interesting results in my experience. You don't have to be complicated. The only key moment here is to discover this extra diagonal that is going to kick it off its balance. It's called the reflex in Frank Lloyd Wright's theory. And it's a whole different lecture, so I'm not going to get into that. But I'll let you visually, I trust that you can visually see how this pans out, because I think all of our brains can recognize these ideas. So here I'm superimposing the notion of that parallel line pattern made out of a parallelogram, in other words, a tilted rectangle, and then how it works when you superimpose it on itself. What kind of new patterns does it create? And slowly developing it further as almost like a stamp. And in this case, you can mirror it, you can rotate it, you can play around the way you would improvise, again, on the piano. And eventually, you use that rubber stamp, so to speak, digitally, and start mapping it out in space, larger space, to see if you can start picking out now the gesture of the bush. And also playing with colors to see if color itself is not necessary in order to take the form further. And at some point, it's important, because the architectural mind wants to see space, to take this exercise into the third dimension. In this case, this was printed on cardboard and sliced and folded in order to create shadow. And at some point, you go back and say, okay, I got to this thing, starting from that plant. It doesn't really have a meaning in and of itself. It doesn't necessarily say a theory, but I know at the end I could not have done that, what's on the right, without the thing on the left. I cannot also say that what's on the right is the thing on the left. It's just two different things, but somehow, as a creative person, I had this experience. And from that point, you can take that further into abstraction without necessarily needing to remember the sumac. It's gone. You are in pure form making. Now I'll show you some other examples of this process by only showing the plant and the final result. This is cornfield in the breeze. If you've ever been in the middle country, states of the United States, cornfields are incredible. They're large cornfields, and when you stand in front of it from a road and there is a wind going, it's quite something as a form. So a whole other process of how I got to that particular pattern, looking at the pine as something that bursts on my face rather than being triangular, or even the majestic cactus in Arizona. And cacti are very interesting to study because they are, by and large, modular. In other words, they have these branches, and if there's a particularly dry season, instead of dying, they drop off a branch, and then they'll grow it back when the season is wet again. And then over time, students have enjoyed this exercise, and these are students of architecture, again, having the freedom to explore form without any guilt, and at the same time with this idea that they are being poets of nature before they can become poets of architecture. So to bring it all back to this notion of the sustainability, I'd like to say that if we do indeed sensitize from studying nature in an abstract way, then we can see architecture in nature and maybe eventually make the two one. Now, obviously, we live in the era of information. It's a big word. Data is a little more geeky version of the same thing. But the word form is inside information. And if you look up the definition of information as a term, it really means making form, giving form. So in nature, we observe that everything it makes is information because it gives it knowledge while it makes it. And that knowledge is mostly captured in structure. And that's where I want to land with this little romantical dance. Structure is everywhere. Now, every organism or plant develops its form as a process of perpetual optimization. At the same time, it destroys nothing in its surroundings and synergizes and harmonizes with it. It's a true symbiosis or co-living. Structure in nature is elegant and conveys its intelligence. In other words, you can reverse engineer it, as we say. Structure in nature is seen through pattern that can exist in all scales, from a leaf pattern to a geological formation. And it was not long ago where we started taking all that into the realm of science. This is 1904. The guy made a sign to prove it, like right on the photo. I mean, it's such a bizarre, almost made-up photograph. The way he's dressed, the way he is as a human being, you can imagine him where he goes to have dinner and drink with his buddies, and look what he's making. Who else is making that at that time? But it's structure that we find attractive and familiar because they are an expression of our rational realm, and also it gives us access to complexity without making us feel lost. And of course, my hero and the father of that type of structure is Minister Fuller, who pioneered lightweight structural thinking way before his time. A lesser known theory, we know him for the geodesic dome for sure, but tensegrity is a theory of structure that he was developing towards the latter part of his career, which has to do with this notion that you have discontinuous compression. In other words, members in compression that are not transferring the load to other members in compression, but they are transferring the load to members in tension. So you have posts held up by cables and creating remarkably mind-boggling structures, almost like you don't believe that these things can withstand or defy gravity. In a way, I think tensegrity structures are like the androids of the trees, maybe the new trees that we're going to have in a little bit. So in a way, I think all of this tells us that imagination has no limits. It indeed soars. The sky's the limit, as so to speak. And in my closing remarks, I would like to submit that by resensitizing to nature, because I think we are born sensitive, it just gets educated out of us. Maybe in part by doing romantical geometric dances with it, maybe not. That we can begin to develop efficient structures that are armatures for nature to be integrated with our life. I'm not saying we need to go back to building with stones in caves. I don't know, maybe that we'll have to do that if we destroy everything. But let's assume that we're not going to destroy ourselves and we will continue to progress. I would think that we're going to have to develop buildings and structures on which nature can actually win. And instead of old paradigms of walls, this is as far as my imagination goes. I'm imagining lightweight structures that nature integrates with and gives us what we need from. So when nature wins, we win. Blagodaria.